I was a freshman in high school on the high school basketball team. And we had a coach who was very Bobby Knight-like, if any of you know basketball, which means very strict. A real tight kind of running the ship. And so this would have been about 1973, 74. And we had a practice and 5-on-5. And one of our guys, a starting center, James Rhodes, he makes a play on a transition move, and the coach calls timeout. Coach Thomas said, "Okay, I got to ask a question." He said, "I was busy yesterday. Was Dr. J playing yesterday on Sunday?" Because if you go back that far, there was no ESPN. There was only one game of NBA players playing on a Sunday. And Dr. J, of course, was the greatest thing out at that time, as he would reach out and either lay the ball up or dunk or had these famous things. So the reason Coach Thomas said that was that our center had a breakaway layup. Instead of doing the laying up against the board, he left just a little after the free throw line and tried to roll it in like Dr. J. And of course he missed. And the coach goes, "I can tell because you guys try to imitate everything that goes on an NBA game." And he said, "Let me tell you, none of you are going to be NBA players. Get that out of your head." I so remember that because I was smart enough not to try to do that, being my jumping ability had limitations. But I flash back to that and flash back to 1991. And I was 6 months from starting my company at the time in the town of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I wanted to start a small company. So I went around and looked at all these small companies that I respected and that had single people owning them, business people. And I went in and interviewed them and talked to them and got their advice because I wanted to compare and see what they all had in common and then where I wanted to take my company, what I wanted to learn from them, which I did 6 months later. Even took a couple of them out for lunch. And it helps you to relate to not only the people, but the companies themselves as you study these things. So what has that got to do with Vero Beach Church today? As Diane looks at me like, I don't have a clue where you're going with this. Do you on most of them that I give? Probably not. The title is, "Come to Vero Beach to Rejoice." Come to Vero to rejoice. I put that title up because I would like us to compare. And there are a lot of similarities between the church written here in the Bible and the church we have in Vero Beach. Many of you may not even have thought that. That's why I'm bringing these things out. So what do we have in common, and then is there something missing? And does God fill in the blanks for us? I think He does. And I'd like to look at that because the church of Philippi was a lot like the church here in Vero Beach. Even though there's 1,900 years basically difference between us, there are so many similarities that we can use the advice that God gave that church to help with our church here in Fort Lauderdale, I believe. Philippi was unique because it was the first church started in Europe. There are no. All other churches in the world that have Christianity tied to their name go back to this church, started in Macedonia. In Acts 16 and verse 9, you can find that. We won't turn there. Also, you might know that Philippi was named after a famous person. Anybody help me with that? Philip. Yes, and who was Philip? King. And who was his famous son? Alexander the Great, who they named after. So that was what this area became known as, Philippi, and that's the church. And there was also a famous battle fought there where over 200,000 men gathered to fight. And one of those generals at the time was King Philip. And 40,000 men were slaughtered in a little area from both armies. And it became famous after that point. And one of the reasons it became famous is they buried those 40,000 men. And family members of those 40,000 men, being it was mostly a field at that time, started coming to pay their respects. And next thing you know, people started coming to Philippi. Do you know how Vero Beach started? Anybody? I was hoping you did, because I do not know.
Well, one of the reasons is because they wanted to make, the rich people wanted to make the shoreline over there places to hang out, have fun, and
Became like a vacation.
vacation. And then they wanted a place in the interior on this mainland to house the help,
To service them.
to service them.
Okay, I figured somebody would know. But I want you to think about the book of Philippians. Most have read it. Most will understand that it was actually, if not the favorite church, it was second to only Thessalonica church, the Thessalonians, as one of Paul's favorites. Not a lot of issues, very spiritually strong church. I bring that up because the city of Philippi, according to historians, had around 10,000 people. Small little village, you would say, or town. How about Vero? Anybody know what the 2024 population statistics of Vero Beach? 17,760 people in Vero Beach proper, not the surrounding areas. So some similarities there. Did you also know that around 8% of the wealth was controlled by, or the wealth of Philippian people were controlled by 8% of the people? Vero is 11%. Now, I'm not here to give a statistical sermon, but I think you might find that interesting. And then, what do you consider wealthy? Well, according to the statistics, wealthy is people making $200,000 or more a year, which I would consider that. If I made $200,000 a year, I would consider myself very well off. I wouldn't be counting pennies if I had that. But Paul spent about 3 months living in Philippi on his second missionary journey. You know, he was first not allowed to go to Macedonia or Europe, as we know, as the scriptures tell us in Acts. But then God opened up and said, I want you to go over here. Because he was no longer going to be around Jewish people. They were all going to be Gentiles. And God asked him to take this gospel into the Gentile nations. And if you remember the story, you can read that in Acts 16 if you choose to. He came to town, and there was no synagogue. There was nowhere to meet on Saturday because there were so few Jews. And a synagogue required at least a dozen men of Jewish faith. Shaking her head, I knew you would know that. And so Paul went down to the river where he met with some women, all women. And he found that they were meeting to worship God. And so he stopped there and worshiped with them, taught them. And there was a woman in purple, or a woman known as the woman of purple. Her name was Lydia. That's what she did for a living. Had threads and so forth of this royal color. So Lydia invited this Paul to her house and said, "You can have the church here." And so he then baptized Lydia, and they started having church. And everything was going along just fine. And then he walked through the city, just looking at everything. And all of a sudden, a young girl follows him around for, it says, days. And she follows him around. And she said, "These men are from God, and they will lead us in the way to salvation." Except she said it again and again and again and again, to after a while, Paul decides to shut her up. She happened to be a young girl who had a gift, as the Gentiles called it. She could predict the future. And she made a lot of money for these merchants who brought people in. And Paul then cast a demon out of her. And she was no longer able to predict the future. She's no longer a seer, as they called it back then. And the people then demanded, who does this? Look what's happening to our markets. How dare he? And he even worships. This is a man who doesn't worship like we worship. He doesn't keep Roman law. He's terrible. And they locked him up. Except they took him in. First thing they did was they beat him with rods. Anybody know how big those rods were? Anybody got a thumb? Look at your thumb. The rods that they were allowed to beat them with could be no wider than your thumb. I don't know if you've ever had like a little switch. I don't know if your parents beat you with a switch. But that's how wide that switch was, and they were usually beaten 39 times across their bare backs. So that's what happened to Paul and his friend here. And then they locked them up and put them in jail. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, there was an earthquake. And the jailer had fallen asleep. And he woke up, and he just knew all the prisoners had escaped. But they didn't. Paul was still there. And so he took Paul to his house, cleaned him up, put stuff on his back. And Paul taught him the gospel, and he was converted. And then Paul decided to go right back into jail. They had him. And the next morning, they were all excited because, oh, wait a minute, did people escape? This earthquake? And there was Paul. And they said, as you have to understand, they were very superstitious. Why did this happen? Because this man cast out this demon, and it threw their whole town into uproar, the city of Philippi. And they come and say, "You can leave." To which Paul said, Nope. Did you know you have just beaten a Roman citizen? I am a Roman citizen. And a Roman citizen was never allowed to be touched unless there was a trial. There was no trial. He was beaten. He was also not only beaten, he was put in stocks. So it was the worst kind that he was there. So he wasn't going to leave to where they finally found, we're in trouble. Then they begged him to leave because he could appeal to Rome. Rome would send their people down and take away all their power, if not their money, and cause them problems. So I bring that out as a backstory to see the kind of, so you can, the church then was to be started once Paul left with Lydia and obviously this jailer and various people who were then brought into the church. Philippi was 13 kilometers from water. How far is Vero? 8 miles, 7 miles. So it's pretty close. We're about, how many miles is it? Maybe 5 miles? 5 miles to the ocean? They were about 7, 8 miles from the ocean. So there were a lot of some similarities and so forth. Now, as I go into this, I'd like you to think about that church. How big was it? Paul wrote the letter to the Philippians somewhere between 49 and 50 AD or ACE, if you want to be specific. He wrote the letter to the church. How many people do you think was at the church, according to Wehoff? Wehoff is a famous historian and writer who studied it for years, went and was in the excavation of it, and Wehoff knew a lot if you want to look up his name. But he came up with the amount of people in 49 to 50 AD in Philippi. And the number he came up with, 33. 33, which is about the number that we have here, isn't it? As a matter of fact, at its peak, according to Wehoff, 20 years later, they had 75 to 100 people attending the church in Philippi. So, I go to that because when Paul wrote this letter, he was in prison. He was kept in prison in Rome, and he wasn't sure of his release. Wasn't sure whether they were going to release him or kill him. And so he wrote a letter to this little church, little compared to Rome. And I want to look at some of those scriptures and instructions so that we can take those, being we are similar in size, we're similar even in areas, we're similar in so many ways. So if you will join me in the book of Philippians, I'll read from the New King James Version. And if you will, I'd like you to go with me to chapter 4 and verse 1. So therefore, my beloved and longed for brethren, my joy. Philippians 4 and verse 1. My joy and crown, stand fast in the Lord. What does stand fast mean? Movable. Immovable. Right? If you want somebody to stand fast, you want them to stand strong on what they believe in. Persevere. Yes, even when hard times come. So this is a church that he's writing to. And so he says, stand fast in the Lord. And go down to verse 6, chapter 4. He said, be anxious for nothing, but in everything give prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be known to man, to God. Think on that. Be anxious for nothing. What does that mean? Anybody? Stop worrying. Stop worrying about things. What happens to us even today? We worry about this. We worry about that. We worry about things we need to worry about, don't we? So he's saying, relax. Trust in God. And stop worrying. What will you worry about this week? So there is. You guys got something to worry about. If you drive a car on I-95, you have an opportunity to not be anxious. Think on these things. How you need to get peace in your life is to not be anxious. Because we all are. I had a person tell me one time, he said, I thought when I retired I would not have a worry in the world. He said, I was wrong. I'm not retired yet, but I'm sure many of you can see that you don't just stay home watching The View and soap operas all day. But let's go down to verse 8, chapter 4 and verse 8. He said, finally, after he goes through these things, I encourage you to read the book of Philippians. It takes 30 minutes and you can read the entire book. He said, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good virtue, if there's any virtue and if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. So he's saying, what? Have a positive mindset. That kind of helps you have a positive mindset when you don't worry about something. But if you're worried about something, you're usually, oh well, is that going to happen? Is the other shoe going to drop? Do I have to worry about this now? Or if you have crossed the 65 plane, which I can honestly say I did, you worry and went, ow, that hurts. It didn't used to. And you start feeling older. And you can go, uh-oh, wonder what's wrong. Or you can go, God, I don't know what that is, but I need to feel better. Help me to feel better. Then I'd like you to go back in Philippians. Go back to chapter 1, if you will. Chapter 1. Verse 27. Chapter 1, verse 27. He tells them, only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast, just like he said earlier, in one spirit with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. He's writing this letter. Can you read between the lines here? It's a very spiritual church, except some people here aren't getting along. They need to be of one spirit, of one mind. Could that be here? I don't see a great deal of it. But only you know that. So be of one mind. And then he goes to chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 5. Said, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Why? Because we settle all of our problems if we had the mind of Christ. I'd know how to treat everybody if I had the mind of Christ. But he's saying, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ. Which allows us to try to be like Christ. Do we? He's telling the church, if you do, guess what? Things are going to get a lot better. are you really doing this? Go with me to chapter 2 and verse 14. It said that you may be blameless and harmless children of God, without fault, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights. But that's 15, isn't it? So he wants them shining as lights. But verse 14, he says, do what? Do all things without complaining and disputing. Must be a problem in this little church. This little church of 33 people. You know what's interesting? Paul uses over 100 personal pronouns here, which is a lot. He also mentions 11 different people. He mentions a third of the church right in his letter. So it's kind of like you can't hide out with Paul. Plus, this letter would have been written to the church, and somebody would have stood up in the church and read it. And you know, some people are thinking, boy, I hope he doesn't mention me. But he did. He mentioned 11 people. So let's go to the main points I want to get to today here. Chapter 4. And now we get to see. We get to pull back the curtain. We get to see a little bit here. But it gives us some understanding that perhaps you've never had before about the church of Philippi, about the Philippians. Because we read verse 1. But in chapter 4 and verse 2, he addresses two people, two women. And you know what he says? I implore Euodia. That was one of the women's names. Not a very popular name today. Have you ever heard Euodia? No. I don't think Taylor Swift would want to be named Euodia Swift. But he said, I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. What does that tell you? They weren't getting along. You had two women here that just like, rah, 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 and rah, rah, rah. They weren't getting along. And he knew it. And now, just read it in front of everybody here. Can you imagine being Euodia and Syntyche? One of them sitting on this side of the room and the other sitting on that side because they didn't want to be sitting next to each other. Right? Means what? An accident. Oh, don't know if I want that name. Do you know you're an accident? No. But here, you can see how this would be taken seriously in the church. After Paul is imploring. He said, I implore you. Almost, I beg you to get along. Let's go on down. And I urge you also, true companion, whoever is reading this, help these women who labored with me in the gospel with Clement also. So these women helped him build this church. Doesn't mention Lydia, whether she's still there by this time. According to history, she moved around because she was a businesswoman. She went to Rome. She went to various places. So he's saying, these women helped me to do the work that brought the first church in Europe, get it established, and now they can't get along. And the rest of my fellow workers whose names are written in the book of life. Do we get that one? Even though Euodia, Syntyche, they're not getting along, their names are written in the book of life. So in case you didn't know that, they weren't perfect. And in case you didn't know this, I hope I'm not having to make this big announcement. Neither are you. None of us are perfect yet. And we have little issues, and we're going to have problems, and we're going to have this and that. But he says, with the mind of Christ, all can be worked out. You don't have to be mad at somebody for a year, for even a month, or even a week. You can work this out because you are a very balanced church. Got your act together. Let's finish this. And he says in verse 4, rejoice. Okay, he just got done addressing. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Rejoice. He just didn't say, and I want you to rejoice. No, he says rejoice. Why? Because there's not any rejoicing going on in the church, is there? You got different people having different conflicts and so forth. They're grumbling, they're arguing, they're complaining. And this is a church in 49 to 50 AD that God is trying to call people into. That we know from history within 20 years that church is going to double or almost triple. Is this because of this letter? That people took to heart what was laid out there? No. So let's go on as I finish this in Philippians 4 and let's go down to verse 13. Verse 13. We all know this verse. Everybody quotes it. You can see it on billboards. You can see it on the bottom of tennis shoes. You can see it everywhere. Right? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He was reminding them of that, wasn't he? He says, nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but only you. Wait a minute, he just left Thessalonica. He's got all these churches. He's got churches in Corinth. He's got churches in Rome. He's got churches all over here. And when there was distress, who helped him out? You have to realize Corinth was a large church. Rome was a large church. Even Thessalonica. These were not small cities. Thessalonica was over 100,000 people. And yet, who helped him out? That little bitty 33-person church from that little town of 10,000 people. Tells you a lot, doesn't it? Tells you why this church was special. Why he felt it. Verse 16. For even in Thessalonica you sent aid once and again for my necessities. As Paul had to travel, people sent money. Hell, where was these other churches? Where were these big churches? But he could depend on his one little church. That may, if you read the letter, you may say, oh, there's some dysfunction going on there. Why, there could be a dysfunctional family. Have you guys ever met a family that didn't have some dysfunction in it? I haven't. I see people looking, smiling, laughing, so I'm not the only one at home. Right? It happens. But look at the heart. Look at the heart. And that's what he is saying to them. Verse 17. Now that I seek the gift but seek the fruit. Not that I seek the gift, but seek the fruit that abounds to your account. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you. Here they did. They sent with this guy. Stuff to make sure, Paul. He's in prison. Any of you ever know anything about a Roman prison? Hope not. At the time, Roman prisons had an obligation to hold you until your trial, which could be a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. Okay? Their job was to hold you. And they had one obligation: to give you water. No food. They never fed any prisoners. That wasn't required of them. If you wasted away, you wasted away. But their obligation was to give you 2 to 3 cups of water a day. I happened to see at one of the prisons there when I was in Rome, of supposedly where Paul and Peter were kept. We don't want to go there. One little light, one little with bars and concrete walls, and that's about it. The Romans had it that if you didn't have friends or family, they'd let you starve to death. Do you see the impact that this little church had on Paul? He was in prison, they think, for around 2 years here. The food came from here. That is impactful to me. I don't care how small a church is. With God, size doesn't matter. What matters is the size of the heart in the people. And that's what Paul was writing this to. A sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. And I bring this out because we're a lot alike. I see very giving. I've had things that you have given various people here, and most of you have been involved in sending things, supplies and help to Haiti. Even to now we have a new church, very poor church in Guyana. And I've had people here ask me, what do you need? That's why I kind of look at the similarities, is people here actually care. And like Paul, you look at every gift. And the Philippians were gifted. They were gifted in giving. It's not that they were rich, very many people, but they were gifted in giving. So, it's who they were. And brethren, it's who you are. And many people in here want to help those who need it, because you got a little more than what you need. A lot alike the church of Philippi and the church in Vero Beach, except for one thing. I like, yeah, but you lack still one thing. And this is the basis for the letter. Is he praised them, corrected them. But the Philippians did not rejoice. They did not have joy. And that is not how this church is. There is joy in this church. You laugh, you enjoy, you share food, we talk. I want to look at that as I wrap this up today, because you do have what they lacked. I'll make my point, and you can look at these scriptures later, because I want to keep on time today, since I hope you will join us for the Bible study, being it is Very, very interesting to me, and hopefully it will be to you. There are 104 verses in the book of Philippians. 104 verses, just 4 chapters. 9 times, Paul has to tell this church to what? Rejoice. Rejoice, rejoice, rejoice. Philippians 1, verses 18 and 26. Chapter 2, 18 and 28. Chapter 3, verse 1. Chapter 4, verse 4. Chapter 4, verse 10. 7 times Paul talks about joy. 9 times about rejoicing. Why do you think he did that? Because of what they were lacking. When you're caught up arguing and bickering, you're caught up with worry, you're caught up with stress, it's hard to rejoice, isn't it? And many of you in here, I've gotten to know you over the last, 3 years? How long have I been here? Nobody knows? I figured you had the exact day. 3 years? Okay, I thought it was exact. See, she knows. She's ready for me to leave. Now, over 3 years, I've known there's health problems. Been here. There's problems of financial problems. There's been a lot of issues here. But you have not let it take your joy. And that's what God wants. So even though we have comparisons between how we're similar to Philippi, there's also a difference. I don't have to tell you to rejoice. I've been here for a night to be much observed. I don't have to tell you. I don't have to tell you various things when we have picnics or anything else. You enjoy life. And that's what God wants us to do, isn't it? We can get all bogged down in life's problems. Right, Tracy? Or we can rejoice. We can't let everything consume us. So why rejoice? Why did he tell them they needed to rejoice so many times? Because he had a couple of reasons. He could speak from experience about Philippi. He could say, I want you to rejoice because you're not in prison. Pretty good reason to rejoice. Second, you haven't been beaten with sticks yet. Pretty good reason if you've ever been beaten. Your feet have not been put in stocks. And you haven't been chained. A pretty good reason to rejoice. And the second, as is mentioned here, your names are written in the book of life. And that isn't just the book of life, it's the book of eternal life. Kept up there. He has it written. That is a reason to rejoice. And that is a reason we need here to be able to rejoice, and I think you do. So I bring this out because Bill actually brought this up to me, I don't know, a month, 2 months ago, when he heard me give a sermon, or watched it, about Thessalonica as I compared Fort Lauderdale to Thessalonica. So many similarities there. And he said, why don't you come down and give that down here? I said, but you're not, this church isn't like Thessalonica. They're different churches. And I said, we'll work on that. So that's when I started looking at Philippi and realized just how similar. I bring that up as I close my message today. Because this week, I got home on Monday afternoon, and I had a message on my phone of a man that I had been taking care of, looking after. That was in a rehab center. And I had spent the last 6 years looking after this man at least once a week. Mary can attest to that. Calling, I don't know how many times. Very needy. And he wanted to go back home to Mexico. And I was trying, but he had all kinds of health problems. Wasn't going to allow him to go. And so he left me a message Saturday night, being I turned my phone off. But he left me a message saying, would you come by the rehab? Would you come by the hospital? He called it a hospital. You come by the hospital and trim my beard. He's asked me a lot of stuff. You would not believe. And so Monday when I got home, I just kind of took care of a couple of things. And my Tuesday morning was planned to go see him after the traffic died down. And so at 8:03, I get a call. And it's from the center, being I am his custodial person. He had died. He passed away before I could finally see him. And they needed me to take care of everything for him. His name is Joseph Segwe. At one time, he was a member of the church, but he lost his way for decades. Until he saw my number on a TV show that we ran, or saw a number, and then he called that number to find someone, a minister who could help him. He hadn't graced a church in 30 years, 40 years. And he called me at midnight one night with a gun in his mouth to pull the trigger and to kill himself. It was over. And it was my first real big, well, I guess there was one more suicide attempt. But we talked for about an hour on the phone. We were living in the condos at the time. And I talked for about an hour. And I said, let's have breakfast. It's not worth it. It's just not worth anything. And I said, well, if you want to do it after breakfast, fine. But I got to have breakfast and you need to have breakfast with me. So at least I see you before you go. Because after an hour, I just figured I'm not getting anywhere. So I wanted to change his state. And so, sure enough, we had breakfast. And that started a 6-year relationship. And he must be the biggest pain anyone has ever had. At the hospital, when they asked me about him, I said, he's going to be your most difficult person you've ever had in your life. And they said, we've had some pretty difficult people. But by the end, they were going, you were right. I did love him, as difficult as it was. But he had no joy. He could not find joy in his life. As a matter of fact, you read his records, Tracy. I took them to you and took him down to your hospital and so forth. he could not find joy in anything. The only thing he did when I saw him on Thursday before I left, Wednesday before I left to go to Guyana, he said, I know you got to go down there and help people down there and here where people right here need your help. And I'm one of them. I said, I told you I have to limit it once a week. Oh, you're a big shot now. I said, if you think I am, Joseph, that's okay. But then he looked and he said, pray with me. So I listened to him pray. Then I prayed. And then he quoted off the top of his head the Lord's Prayer. I wanted to see if he would get through it all. And he did. And he said, I didn't forget. I hope God doesn't. So he's in God's hands, but it taught me just how important it is, because he was 74 years old. Been sick for the last 3 or 4. But no time in our 6 years did I ever find a time that he rejoiced. I came one day and thought I would just, I memorized like 3 or 4 jokes that I thought he would find funny. I bombed that day. He didn't find anything funny. But as I was working, cleaning out his house and getting some stuff ready, I was looking and said, God, I can't find that gun. Because I remember seeing it in the past. And that's, I think, is the only joy that he ever gave me, is he got rid of the gun. But I wish I could have had him have joy in his life. Let's not have a life like that. Let us rejoice. And as Paul told them, it's like I would love to, and I probably told him many times, again, I say, rejoice.